Are you enjoying the Single Tracks podcast? Well, we could use your support. The small but dedicated Single Tracks team works hard to share the mountain bike information that inspires epic adventures through this podcast, our worldwide database of trail maps and photos, and daily news and reviews on the website. So consider becoming a monthly, annual, or lifetime pro supporter and enjoy ad-free browsing on the website, free Single Tracks stickers in the mail, and discounts on merch for as little as $3 per month. Go to singletracks.com/support to sign up and to find out other ways you can help support our mission. That's singletracks.com/support. Thank you and happy trails. Hey everybody, welcome to the Single Tracks podcast. My name is Jeff, and today my guest is Chris Currie. Chris is a bike industry veteran with decades of experience in everything from retail and marketing to product design. His patented mountain bike suspension design, dubbed 3VO, is well regarded and is currently being used by Jamis bikes in their full suspension bike line. Thanks for joining us, Chris.
Oh, thanks very much for having me, Jeff.
Well, you've been in the bike industry for quite some time, so tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, it's been quite a while. I got my start officially in 1997. I started a bike shop, online bike shop, which was a novelty at the time.
Yeah, wow, an online bike shop in 97.
Yes, sir. I listen to a lot of marketing podcasts these days, and I find myself feeling older and older as I listen to them talking about how they started this exciting new business in the early days of the internet, and they actually had an e-commerce store in 2003 or 2005, and I'm like, wow, yeah. But we had this idea. It started from I was helping out at various bike shops and things like that. I had an odd job. I was an adjunct English professor. That was my background, is all English. So always good to start an engineering interview with an English major. But my background was English, and I was teaching at a couple different colleges, which is not difficult by a lot of standards, but a lot of running around, a lot of really long hours trying to make ends meet. And had a friend at a bike shop say, well, he knew I was really into bikes. You want to help him run a bike shop? So I started working with him, and fun guy, ex-Supercross racer. So a little seat of the pants as business operations go, and got to see what you should do when you're running a bike shop and what you shouldn't do when you're running a bike shop. And in those early days, had some people say, if you ever started a bike shop, that would be really cool. I think you could, you sort of get the consumer, take care of folks. And so I ended up selling a RockShox Judy using the early days of MTBR. So shout out to Francis there at MTBR, but early days of MTBR classifieds, sold a suspension fork to someone, I believe he was in Singapore, and was completely blown away by this whole internet thing for the prospects of e-commerce. And so got really into the idea of an online bike shop, and started that. That was called Speed Goat. And that opened in 1997 and was pretty successful. Again, there was no real internet commerce at the time. It's a novelty that I believe I had my own email address, an @speedgoat.com email address before I ever had Gmail or anything. I had to, much later in life, I had to create a Gmail account. It was like, oh, but
you skipped over the Hotmail thing and went right to Gmail.
I did. Yeah, I just went right. So it was such an early time that we literally had banks coming in when we were looking at what can we do. The sales were really strong. What can we do? Lines of credit or something like that. We had these two sort of bumbling banker guys even came in and said, did this kind of good cop, bad cop routine on me, which was pretty funny. And the one was like, well, I don't know, Ted. I just don't know how I would feel about giving my credit card information to someone on the internet. And Even back then, I was like, yeah, I think we're on to something, and so that grew, and we specialized in custom built bikes, and which was a little bit unusual. People think of internet as this kind of everything commoditized, Amazon style, bad product information, no personal service, and we really were there for a lot of people that either had to travel very far to get to a quality bike shop or just felt disenfranchised in some way. And there were a lot of them, and we worked really hard to take care of them. A lot of long hours on the phone, a lot of emails, and I had this reputation for custom building bicycles. So you became this center for information, and you could compare brands and things like that because we were offering all the best brands, and that became an excellent word of mouth kind of engine, and the business grew. But I had always had a love of motorcycles before bicycles, and was just always really into the design and the mechanics of everything, and getting to play with all of these greatest bicycles in the universe at the time was a tremendous inspiration. To get to work with the early Santa Cruz bikes and know those guys a little bit and talk with them, and Chris Kokalis. This predates Pivot, and predates even DW Link technology. When it was horse length Titus bikes, and seeing the amount of attention to detail that Chris put into designing bikes and everything. I mean, there's so many people, some known, some not as well known, who have helped get us where we are, and huge inspiration. And so taking all that in, I definitely developed a passion for the design and for solving problems, which is ultimately what all this is, with suspension design, and that's what led to the early desire to do it ourselves.
Yeah. Well, in 2004, I believe you started developing this new mountain bike suspension platform. So what was sort of the need that you saw back then? What was like not being done, or what did you see as a way to improve the existing suspension designs?
It's funny because I'm going to make it seem like I come from a time before there was fire or the written word. But at the time, some of the challenges, we would laugh about them now, but some of the challenges were simply how to deal with this new thing called 29-inch wheels. Most suspension designs couldn't accommodate the larger wheel size. They just simply weren't built for it. And, this was a time when 120 millimeters of travel was significant as well. If you had a bike with 5 or 6 inches of travel, that was considered, was your downhill bike. So to get any type of travel out of a 29er was a task. And at the time, I had convinced Chris Kokalis, then of Titus Cycles, that the world needed a 29-inch Racer X.
Yeah.
And 29ers were, I don't remember exactly when they appeared on the scene. It came about. You'll remember how it came about, though. It wasn't like wham, all of a sudden they existed. It was, like many things in the industry, you hear of a friend who has this thing, and then Marzocchi kind of makes a fork, and
right,
and you get that to work, and then nobody makes tires, so you find a tire that kind of works. IRC had the mythos there for a while, and it was slim pickings, but it was. There wasn't a lot going on for 29ers, and I fell in love with the 29-inch wheel like right from the start. And part of that was maybe a little bit of motorcycle background and stuff like that. It just felt properly scaled to me. I'm not overly tall. I'm about 6 feet tall, but it just suddenly felt so right. And my first 29er was a Vicious Cycles The Motivator. Carl at Vicious would scold me if I didn't make sure I included the. It's not just Motivator; it's The Motivator. Right. And full rigid bike, and just loved that bike to death, and just loved the big wheels. But there weren't suspension bikes at the time, for 29-inch wheels. And when they were very short travel. So I convinced Chris to build me a wasn't one off. I'm sure he built a couple more for himself and others, but a custom Titus Racer X with 29-inch wheels.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, you really couldn't squeak that much travel out of them. So that was the real challenge. I think it had 80 millimeters of rear travel. Or something like that. And, the angles of the day, which by today's standards would be considered horrifying. And that thing was great. And me being me, I put a really large front fork on it, which was way bigger than what it was intended for. It was all mad scientist out. And, and Chris came out to ride with me at one point and was like, hey, this is pretty cool, with the slacker head tube angle at the time and some of that other stuff. So it was just developing things that rode a certain way that I wanted, and filling these voids that existed. And when it came to the suspension system, I just, with everything I rode, and I was at that point riding some really great stuff. That was the early days of the original VPP technology from Santa Cruz, and you had some excellent suspension systems starting to hit the market, but there wasn't anything that quite did this thing that I was looking for. I couldn't really articulate, didn't have the tools, the skill set, and education to articulate, but I wanted something out of the ride of my bikes that I wasn't getting. And like a lot of people, that's where you start to get yourself into trouble. The whole, I got this vision.
Right.
And I tried to work it out. And at the time we were running the company, so we had a foundation to go by. We had great resources. I had, a phenomenal shop with all the tools available and everything. So we just started thinking about this and tinkering. And I actually, I've come to realize if anybody's listening to this and you're at a bike shop, don't do this. This is the wrong way to do things. But, in this day and age, what you would do is you would say, oh, I am a bike dealer and I want to have more control over the product. Mm-hmm. So I will go to AliExpress or call up a factory in China or find some way to get some open mold frame, mm-hmm. put my stickers on it, and there you go. Now I have a house brand.
Right.
I've never been that bright, so my attempt at house brand was completely redefine bicycle suspension as the world knows it, as like step one, So I was like, well, we need to do our own bike, and it has to have this suspension system, and it has to be really innovative. And I had the vision, and I couldn't quite articulate it. And then of all the tools I started to use, started teaching myself SolidWorks and some other things, and all just an attempt to figure out this ride that I was seeing, but couldn't quite articulate. Hired an engineering company. Like so many crazy adventures, this engineering company in Pittsburgh. I was on the East Coast at the time. I'm originally from near Pittsburgh. Mm-hmm. Hired an engineering company. Unbeknownst to me, they were in the process of going out of business while they were taking care of me as a client. Mm-hmm. So I would show up, and it was a drive for me to get to their offices, and I would wait, and then the owner would say, doesn't look like he's coming in today. And their SolidWorks guy just wouldn't show up. And I'm like, well, boy, that's really not right of him, So I would just kind of use his computer a little bit and see what he'd been working on, or what I had a little bit of mm-hmm. access. If you've driven all the way down there and you're paying them, the least they can do is let you see what they've been working on.
Right.
So in that roundabout way, taught myself enough SolidWorks, that and with an engineering friend that I had at the time, learned enough SolidWorks to be completely dangerous, and started, really putting some flesh on the bones of these ideas that I had. Mm-hmm. But then one night, it sort of all came together for me. And at that point, I had a good bit of technology and the skill to use it. But I ended up saying, well, there's this certain thing I'm trying to do with axle path, and there's a certain thing I'm trying to achieve with the ride of the bike.
Yeah.
and I just cut little pieces of paper out. And it's just not, this is not, I think, how a lot of people would go about designing an innovative suspension system. But
Mm-hmm.
it, I was able to move the little swing arm on the little fake bicycle that I made,
Mm-hmm.
just there on the table at 2 a.m. or whatever, when the kids had finally gone to sleep. And I could see it finally in my head. Oh,
Yeah.
like, this is what you're doing. And it was because of the larger 29-inch wheels. And it would be fair to say that I was trying to create a system that was built around that wheel size, or the need for that larger wheel size,
Mm-hmm.
versus what had come before, which was all based on 26-inch wheels. And it's a tremendous difference, because everything is really keyed on the center of the bottom bracket. Kind of the heart of the bike is dead center of the bottom bracket. And with the 29-inch wheel, you not only have a larger wheel diameter, but you have what's called more bottom bracket drop. And for anybody out there that doesn't totally nerd out on bike geometry, that simply means that your bottom bracket, the center of your cranks around which everything rotates, is actually lower than your rear axle.
Right. Which is a change from 26er.
It's a big change. It's lower than the 26 by a pretty considerable amount when every millimeter counts.
Mm-hmm.
And one way to look at that is that's almost as if your suspension is partway through completely compressed right from the start.
Right.
Because relative to the bottom bracket, it's already much higher. That had been the challenge with the 29ers in general. And there were some cool ways to approach that. What Niner was starting to do at the time with the early CVA and stuff. These were all things that you knew. You learned enough at a certain point to appreciate the work of others. You could say, "Aha, that's somebody trying to address this dilemma."
Right.
And so the 2 hours later, the answer to your question is, it was all a desire to address the unique challenges of new wheel sizes, and how a suspension system could really do that, and be able to articulate in a variety of conditions. Like, we had East Coast is known for rock gardens, and we had, rock gardens, like, being out here on the West Coast now. I got plenty of loam. I'm a very happy guy, but the rock gardens are slightly different. And for anybody who hasn't ridden on the East Coast, you have these kind of, I've described it as kind of like medieval graveyard looking situation. Like the rocks are like highly uncooperative, let's say.
Right.
And, a suspension system that could handle that, which is a relatively slow speed rock crawling sort of control affair, and then also be highly capable at speed, in corners, and just, serve all those purposes. That was kind of the long list of criteria that it had to be able to do. And so that was the motivation: have it work well and have it work with the bigger wheels.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I guess to a lot of us, it would seem like going from 26-inch wheels to 29-inch wheels, you just kind of scale everything up, make the tubes a little longer, things are a little higher, maybe they're in different places. But yeah, that's interesting to understand that there's a whole lot more going on there, and it's not as simple as just making a bigger bike. Right.
It really changes everything, and everything is interdependent, which even today is the number one challenge behind everything with the suspension design. You can optimize, one particular variable,
mm-hmm.
and great, got the numbers exactly where you want them. And then, check your other numbers, and you just roast all of them, So,
yeah.
It becomes it really did involve a kind of rewriting of the rules to a degree,
mm-hmm.
when that wheel size became so popular. And I mean, it wasn't, even if it hadn't become popular, I would have been designing a bike around 29-inch wheels. I was totally obsessed with 29-inch wheels. To exist at a time before 29-inch wheels and be riding 26-inch wheel bikes, not to take anything away from the diehard 26 crowd out there. I see you represent, but when you're crawling over rocks and stuff like that, and just trying to maintain speed in corners and everything, it was, to have 29-inch appear out of nowhere like that. Well, not nowhere, shout out to Carl at Vicious and Gary Fisher and the crew. But I was so addicted to that I would have been trying to build better 29-inch bikes or do my little part to build a better 29-inch bike, whether they caught on or not.
Yeah. Well, what were some of the big roadblocks that you ran into along the way with 3VO? I mean, aside from working with an engineering company that was going out of business and, trying to fit all this in on the side and everything else you were doing, like what were some of the like design hurdles that you ran into along the way?
A lot of it goes back to that question of balance that I mentioned. You can optimize, in a sense, I've been working on this for, all those years. Really, this is a much more than a decade has this been a constant source of, late night activity or tinkering in the background. And really you solve for one variable and you introduce a problem with another. So it really is a matter of just kind of putting it together from an optimization standpoint. That's like the philosophical, theoretical challenges that you encounter. The actual make it challenges are a whole separate animal. And those in some ways are so much worse. You can create the perfect creature on paper, and a lot of armchair designers out there have made some really cool stuff. Getting it made is really difficult. And figuring out how best to go about that is really difficult. And for me, I was too busy with the e-commerce store and everything to really. I had the patent. That was actually comical. I don't know whether there's some special legal reason why nobody talks about patents, but I'll be stupid enough to go ahead and talk about it. It's kind of a funny story because I submitted the patent, worked with a lawyer to patent the technology, and to my thinking, I've only learned more since. It's actually like an eminently patentable technology. It's pretty easy to articulate what's unique about it. You can do so pretty directly and physically, unlike a lot of like more esoteric, numbers and nuances and stuff. And but at the time, I'm doing this for the first time, and I'm working with this lawyer, and the meter's running, and you're trying to get everything just right. And anybody that has gone through this, it's never pleasant. But I go through all this and I submit it, and the patent comes back. I get a communication after a series of months, or what, it takes various amounts of time, and they said, well, we can grant these portions of the patent, but we can't grant these other portions of the patent because there's prior art. And it was one of those sad trombone, like wah wah kind of moments. I had done beyond just mere hours. It was like several double digits, potentially triple digit hours of research, trying to count for everything, and most of it was known. I know my history. I know Mert. I know everything Greeny and Santa Cruz did, and Weigel, and just doing all this research. But I looked at what they cited, and I realized, wow, a lot of it, like, you tend to think that anybody who looks at your patent is going to be as into it as you are and as knowledgeable as you are. And like, one of the things that they said that they took issue with was completely different. In fact, it turned out nothing was anything like what I was doing. I mean, was like radically different. Those of us who were unified rear triangle bikes, where like the whole drivetrain was attached to the rear axle, like they didn't have a suspension system like today's bikes, like the old Trek Y bikes and stuff. The whole drivetrain went up and down when you hit stuff. That was one of them.
Oh, wow.
Where they were, and I was like, oh, well, it's definitely not that, and I started to unpack it, and it turns out that with a few minor revisions, everything was able to be granted. So the initial alarm of like, oh, wow, there's stuff that I didn't account for. It was stuff that I had accounted for, but I had dismissed right away because it wasn't even close.
Right.
So that was in 2010. That was granted in full, and the challenge then became the manufacturing. And I didn't do anything with it right away. I was pretty busy with everything else that was going on. And at the time, right around that time, the first Yeti showed up. The first Yeti Switch Infinity bike showed up, and that wasn't. it wasn't the same as what I had going on, but it was the first thing that kind of was even in the ballpark.
Yeah.
And that was really a shot across the bow where I was like, wow, I really need to do something with this. I've put all this time and energy into this, and I've just put it on the shelf. And at that point I'd sold my business, and I'd moved away from it. And the timing just worked out. I finally had time to just look at it and say, okay, I got to get serious about a proof of concept bike and actually turn this thing into something physical that I can ride.
Mm-hmm.
And then began that process. And that's, I don't even know where to begin to tell you the challenges of that. There's probably a lot of people out there who would love to make their own bicycle. And there's the truly gifted among us who actually do, pick up the torch and make it happen. And I have just mad respect for those people. But I wanted to figure out ways to potentially set the scene for if you wanted to go into production or something like that. What could you do? Can you get some connections made?
Mm-hmm.
I'd known some people in the industry and stuff like that. So I started talking to a friend in Taiwan and looking at working with a factory there. And I looked at places in the US first because that would have been so much easier. And a lot of people don't realize, a lot of people think you go overseas to save money.
Mm-hmm.
But in fact, there are just entire cities there dedicated to making bicycles occur, and so.
Right. Yeah. They have the expertise there.
And beyond that, they can walk across the street and get that, cable guide that they don't have, and it's all of everything is, I don't want to say frictionless, but it's just built for making bicycles in certain areas. And so, whereas a lot of that, I mean, just recently, I actually went to an engineering place near my house thinking because I'm always working on new versions of this thing and stuff. And just for kind of kicks, I was like, what if you could be fabricating this thing right here in the US, of all, domestic materials and all that other stuff? What would that look like? And I expected, they're going to come back to me with a number that's, relatively terrifying and I'll be ready for it. But it was terrifying on a magnitude that, I could invent a flying car or something for that amount. So I was like, but by comparison, I ended up working with a friend and we did a dozen early prototypes of the suspension system. And that is a really unique experience to have worked on something for, at that point, so many years, mm-hmm. and finally get it in your hands in the garage, taking it out of a box, building it up. And that first time you put a foot on the pedal of this thing that you'd put so much time into.
Yeah.
That's somewhat indescribable.
I mean, I bet you're excited, but also nervous. I mean, you sit on it and you're like, nope, this is all wrong.
Absolutely. And in fact, it's funny because the first version that showed up, I did a really rudimentary version that was different from what Jameis is using now with the official 3BO. This was a slightly different version that was very crude by comparison, but it was there to test certain theories and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And I knew the leverage rates were going to be off. Is going to be really high. Start with a really high leverage. The curve was going to be extreme, and it was going to start really high. So it'd be really, really supple at first, and then ramp up, and it was pretty extreme. And so I was prepared for certain things to not be quite dialed and have to figure that out. But I was so emotionally invested in it that I got on the bike. I pumped up the shock to what I would normally pump my shock up to. I rode it to the end of my driveway, which is not one of those, wild country estate meandering driveways. It's a driveway that's 2 cars long, and was like, I can't even, I turned around, I went in, and I hadn't taken a nap in the daytime since I was 7, but I was just so emotionally drained from that trip down the driveway.
Wow.
I just kind of passed out, and I'm I told myself I'm I don't know, a weaponized pessimist. I've always been really, really hard on myself, and that's kind of led to positive things ultimately. it's like the opposite of the power of positive thinking. I'm like, oh, like thinking what's the worst that could happen and how can I make it not be that?
Yeah.
And so I told myself, oh, it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. I went and I just passed out. And I woke up later, and I was managing some stuff for some marketing stuff for a big e-commerce company out here. At this point, I'm out here on the West Coast, and so I took it to work with me. And this was a pretty big company, and there were a bunch of hardcore bike nerds there. And I took it to work with me, and I just kind of was like, here. And I just gave this prototype frame to these dudes, and it was lunchtime, right? So there's just like guys in a food truck and just like a bunch of hardcore bike people all over the place, and and also they were guys who were a lot lighter than I was. I was probably 200 pounds at the time or whatever, and they're guys are like 140, so a whole different animal if you're over leverage rated out on the bike. So they're coming back to me and they're like, that thing's incredible. Like, you built that? How'd you do? What you do? And I'm like, okay. And I'm just kind of taking the data, and they're like, that thing pedals, that's insane. Like, because it was 160 millimeters of travel or whatever. So there was some really positive reports coming back on the pedaling. And I'm like, okay, step one, whatever, lose 30 pounds or whatever. What it ended up doing. But then also, wait a minute, it is working like it's supposed to work.
Yeah.
Like it's got the basics are there, and then refined it, with a series of changes back and forth with my friend, and then at that point, instead of 2 frames, we the first little batch of the early prototype was just 2 frames. We made a dozen. And at that point, it was pretty much dialed. I mean, there have been changes made for Jameis to optimize for their needs, but what they have is essentially what prototype number 2 was.
Wow. Cool. Well, so I want to ask you some sort of general suspension questions, and then also sort of hear how this applies to 3VO. So what's meant by the term instant center when it comes to suspension design, and how did you think about it in terms of designing 3VO?
Sure. Instant center is understood as the you can think about it as the point around which the swing arm or the rear axle, the point around which it pivots. So on a single pivot bike, like the bikes Orange makes, or your classic Santa Cruz Superlight, stuff like that, you have swing arm that's bolted to the front triangle of the bike in just one fixed position. And so that's very easy. That's your instant center. Your swing arm articulates up and down around that center. It gets more complicated on multi-link bikes, including 3VO and the DW bikes, the Yeti bikes, the Santa Cruz bikes, most of what you see out there these days. Even the Horst Link bikes, they don't appear that way, but they also are multi-link bikes like that. And so in those, you have to sort of discover the instant center because it's not as obvious as a bolt. It exists you can identify it by drawing hypothetical lines through your linkages. So it's easier to visualize, but if you take your link will have a point at which it pivotally connects to your swing arm, and then it connects to your main frame. Mm-hmm. And usually you'll have a couple of those links. And if you were to draw lines right through those bolt holes, one pivot to the next, and you will find a place where the lines coming from your upper link will intersect with the line coming through your lower link, and that is your instant center. So when people see the word virtual, that essentially comes from not having that fixed pivot point.
Right.
Santa Cruz takes us to school here. They're a great lesson because they started with single pivot bikes, so that didn't have anything virtual about it. That bolt is located, and then when they went to the VPP, virtual was made sense to include in the title because it's no longer a fixed physical bolt through the frame somewhere. It's an invisible point in space. But that's your instant center, and it dictates so much. It's a reference point. I mean, it's one of many reference points, but
okay.
it's the foundational reference point for a lot of the kinematics of the bicycle, the anti-squat, and in particular, and a lot of the other characteristics that dictate how the bike rides.
Okay. So is there like an instant center that is optimal or that's better than a different position for an instant center?
There's kind of a continuum of acceptable zones, I guess is the best way to put it, because they if you look at the instant center across a wide variety of bicycles, you'll see them all over the place. We're not talking just a difference in millimeters here. We're talking a difference in meters, feet, yards. Some project it very far out in front of the bicycle. So if you were to draw a line, your horse link bikes, specialized, most known for the horse link, but a lot of the bikes that use the kind of horse link system, kind of classic, derived from AMP research and some of that stuff in the early days, they often project a pivot, an instant center point that's out far in front of the bicycle. Whereas a lot of the more kind of short dual link bikes, including the Yetis and the Santa Cruzes, et cetera, it's much more, it's closer to the bottom bracket.
Okay.
And the thing that's notable about the instant center is unlike on a single pivot bike like an Orange or a Santa Cruz where it's a fixed point in space, the instant center it migrates or it moves around, because as those links rotate, that point in space is moving.
Right.
So that's the thing that really leads to the tunability and things like that. And there's a lot of great stuff that a single pivot bike can do. You can make a really nice single pivot bike, but what it can't ever be is anything other than a single pivot bike. So that is your pivot point, and you got to live with it. And you can do cool stuff where you got linkages in there controlling how quickly you compress the shock and the leverage ratios and stuff like that, like what Evil's up to. But the a single pivot from an axle path and instant center standpoint, you do have that fixed position to work with. Whereas with the multi-link bikes, how it changes as the wheel compresses, as the suspension compresses, can change. And so you can tune it for behavior across the range of compression.
Okay. So yeah, you mentioned rear axle path. How does that affect the ride feel and performance?
It's tough to tease it out individually. Generally, a more rearward axle path is an advantage for those situations where square-edged hits and things like that, where your wheel naturally wants to move rearward in order to offer minimum resistance to the terrain. But I think it's probably most instructive to kind of think about it not so much in terms of what does axle path do, but when does axle path do it? It's kind of a way to put it, but every axle path is somewhat similar. They all trace an arc, from that kind of instant center position. But when they are at their most rearward, will have an effect on things. And this gets super complicated, and I try to keep it light and and not overly dork it out. But
yes, please.
But the easy way to think about it is and a lot of people have done this. There's a ton of stuff you can look up, on online. You guys have covered a lot of cool stuff with it too. The chain is a fixed point. At least the chain as it exists from the top of your rear cassette cog to the top of your chain ring.
Mm-hmm.
That's a fixed point, and that's metal, and that's designed to propel your bicycle. So that thing is not stretching or flexing in any way. That is a fixed drive transmission, similar to anything else. So that being wanting to remain constant is affected by the fact that your axle, the distance from the center of your bottom bracket where your chainring is driven to your rear axle, that varies. So if you were to have a bike that just completely had a rearward axle path where, if you were to put that pivot all the way up by your seat post, so that wheel would go way backward when you hit a bump,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
you would be tugging the heck out of the chain.
Okay.
And, the higher you put that pivot, the more rearward and axle path you would have, but then you would have all these other variables as well.
Mm-hmm.
So just to take that extreme example, there's something desirable about a rearward axle path, but there are also plenty of undesirable things about a rearward axle path.
Okay. Yeah.
So when your axle is rearward versus when it starts to move back toward the front of the bike, and how you balance that with everything else that's going on with the leverage ratio and the anti-squat and all the other characteristics of the bike, it's all a giant balancing act.
Yeah. Yeah. Now I understand why you had to get out the paper and, play with it on the table and really understand like how all these things work together and how they affect one another.
It ended up at the time, it was kind of a clear your head type thing, because there's this movie Searching for Bobby Fischer, in the scene where he just like wipes all the chess pieces off of the board, and it's like, okay, now what would you do? Now what's your move? See it, and it just kind of helped to be like, nah, just kind of like raw instinct. What is it you want this thing to do? How do you want it to articulate?
Yeah,
and you kind of figure out the rest from there. But it's really been, you never stop refining. It's a constant process. I kind of love that part of it. There's some cheesy philosophical journey, not the destination thing here, but new things are happening all the time, and people's tastes are changing. What they look for in a bicycle is changing. So it's that part of it is really rewarding and a lot of fun, just to keep finding ways to make it better.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's so interesting too, that, bicycles seem like they're these really simple mechanical systems. And they've been around forever. And yet, even as riders, I think most of us recognize like bikes keep getting better and better every year, and seemingly really quickly too. This evolution, every year stuff is better, and they find ways to improve them and optimize them. And it's thanks to obsessives like yourself that, keep looking at this and saying, how can we do this better? How can we improve it?
There's just something about the bicycle, right? It's kind of this weird primordial currency, like you'll look at like website design sites and stuff like that, and it's like, we're a bicycle shop, or there's like the bicycle
right.
thing that is this like number one consumer product, is just this example of things. And on the one hand, it hasn't changed any. It's still the basic, same old creature it's always been. And on the other hand, it's mutated a billion times over. It's augmented with motors now. It's got hydraulic systems on board. It's got electronic systems on board. It's got, NASA level technology with suspension theory and equipment and stuff like that. So it's simultaneously this like foundational building block, like the simplest thing you could possibly have, and also like the most complicated thing in the universe. So they're just super cool that way.
So what sort of opportunities or tweaks or improvements do you see for 3VO in the future? What are the things you're looking at, or the things maybe even that you're not happy with and that you hope maybe you have a solution for?
A lot of it is tuning around intended use. I think in addition to the evolution of bicycles in general, the knowledge of riders has, I think more recently, in the last 5 years, more than ever, maybe it just feels this way, has increased as well. So I think, and it remains to be seen, because there's the pandemic effect of a ton of people entering the sport now, which is also really interesting. You have a lot of new riders on the trail. I don't know if I'm seeing, a ton of new riders on the trail by me. And, that's going to have its own separate interesting dynamic. But among the people who are whatever we want to consider them, enthusiasts or just serious, dedicated riders who put a lot of time in on mountain bikes in particular, their level of understanding of what's going on with their bicycle is, I feel, higher than it's ever been. And they know I mean, they don't. There's a lot of things that they don't know, and a lot of people in the industry, find it frustrating. Well, the consumer doesn't know this. The consumer doesn't. Consumer knows a hell of a lot, and there's generally a sense of the type of ride characteristics that somebody's looking for in a bicycle.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think where I am, the most interesting challenge really is you can make a fantastic bike for everybody, and you can make a truly extraordinary bike for a smaller group of people. So how do you balance these things? Because there are different ways to approach it. You can try to make like adjustable bikes that can do this and do that, but then there's always something lacking there.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, it sounds like you're a big fan of flip chips.
Flip chips can be cool, and we did one on the James Portal. Flip chips can be cool, but then there's also something. I'm almost 50-50 on that, really, because I'm also one of these like I don't know what you would consider like highly monogamous bike dudes. You know what I mean? Like I have a bunch of bikes in the garage and whatever, but I'll tend to just like, man, I'll got to ride to the somewhere to pick up my car at the shop or something like that. I take the mountain bike. Like I'm riding the same bike, that I would to go, ride trails. So a lot of times I just spend time on that one bike. So I demand it to be able to just do everything
right
really well. But, for specific purposes, you can really fine tune that balance. What does somebody want to do with this bike, and how do you make it? It sort of expands outward from that core capability, right? Like you got to have a bike that descends really well, that's supple and has the ride that lets people do more than they could normally do. Is kind of the easy barometer. If you faster or however you define success, you're more comfortable, you feel more in control, you are faster. That's what you want, and then that's what we tried to do with 3VO. And then from there, you start to look at like, okay, well, what would that look like to somebody who is racing nonstop? That's a slightly different set of needs and criteria. And it's really where we all are in the industry right now, is that person who wants that longer travel enduro capable bike, but will maybe never, race an official enduro. That's not meritless. They want a certain capability. So they want to be able to descend something that's fun as can be to descend, but they don't quite feel as terrified as all of us used to on our cantilever, full rigid bikes.
Right.
So, how do you balance all of those things? So the same way that the suspension is a matter of balance, the consumer is a matter of balance.
Yeah.
And I think that's really where the opportunity is that fine tuning. And, some of it involves adjustability, but a lot of it involves just clearly defining what you're trying to do with the bike and the design.
Yeah, interesting. Well, outside of suspension, are there other design projects that you're exploring or maybe just kind of turning over in your head right now? Are there other kind of opportunities within mountain bikes?
There's a lot of opportunities for really cool stuff right now. But for me, there's only so many hours in the day, and suspension and the day job keeps me hopping pretty good with I do a lot of marketing stuff and everything with stands, no tubes, and so you get to see that side of it, which in and of itself is its own ecosystem and world. Just tires and rims and tubeless sealant and everything is a fascinating, completely separate universe. Suspension is expansive enough where I've never felt the need to say like, today I build a dropper post. It's like, no, I'm good.
Yeah.
Once you're down to that, 3-4 hours of sleep a night, you're like, you're as innovative as you feel you need to be.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, you spent so long on this particular project too. I mean, did you learn anything or are you hesitant to kind of jump into that again or do you think you learned enough where you're like, okay, I could do this again and maybe take it in a different direction?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I feel like you're always, in some ways, every time you sort of turn on the computer or, pick up the blank piece of paper, you're starting over.
Mm-hmm.
If you're lucky, you bring a little more high caliber experience than you did the last time.
Mm-hmm.
But each thing is a bit of a blank slate, and consumer tastes change, and the demands change for the individual application. But I think one of the coolest things about it is that when you really immerse yourself in this stuff and you kind of live and breathe it, and it's your passion for a long time, you're constantly unlocking things. It has to be. I don't have the chops to comment on what the like the high level mathematician, like the math theory people,
Mm-hmm.
like you dedicate your whole life to trying to find then the pi and all that, so
Right.
that whole stuff. Like, I can't begin to understand what those people's lives are like, but that whole like journey not destination again thing, where it's you're never gonna want to stop. There's always something that addresses something, and you're always discovering things inside what you've already done.
Yeah.
That are little mini revelations, which is really the coolest thing at all. Like, oh my gosh, if I just do this, it just happened recently for me, because you're always working on, the new version of this and the new version of that. And you discover these things that through trying to balance everything. For me, it's probably different for everybody. For me, it's a series of like, okay, I managed to get the absolute perfect number I always wanted on this thing. Now I dare you to keep that and get the perfect number on this other thing. So you got the perfect anti-squat exactly where you want it, doing what you want. Now, what about anti-rise, which is like a whole other world? Like, how do you get the perfect number on that? And it's a lot of trial and error, and it's a lot of figuring out. And it's just a lot of time. But in the process of doing that, you discover these patterns and everything, and that's just super rewarding, and it's in its own way to figure those things out. It's kind of little revelations here and there.
Right. Yeah. And I guess that's in the name of your design too, right? It's all about optimizing those variables and finding, get one where you want it, and then the other one is going to be out of whack until you can optimize that one.
Right. That was a case of let the marketing me drive for a little bit, and like, well, numbers and letters, and what's trademarkable, numbers and letters, because it's really hard. Like, everything's taken. It's really hard to put names and stuff, and it's like, well, what letters and numbers look cool together? And then, well, there you go. Now you've set the challenge for yourself, marketing guy. Now switch over to the other side of your brain and figure out what the hell to do with that. And it's like, it really is about optimizing variables. And so, in the case of the 3VO, that's really what you're kind of going for, is just drawing attention to that balancing act. It's not magic. It's just a matter of like hard work and long hours and balancing things to get that sort of characteristic.
Yeah. Well, the last question I want to ask you is, what do you think is the most annoying thing about mountain bikes at the moment?
I think the approved answer is you're supposed to say standards. That's we all struggle with that. But boy, these are let's acknowledge, outside of the world of bicycles, these are some tough times right now.
Right.
I'm out here in Vancouver, Washington, where my air quality is currently, I don't want to check right now.
Yeah.
We got wildfires, we got general chaos, and disarray in many areas. And I'm not normally like super Captain Optimist, but I gotta say, one of the nice things is that there's a lot that's really cool about mountain bikes right now. This is everybody acts like it's the golden age, but like, those of us who've been doing this for a really long time and have, carried our bike home when the fork snapped off, and all these other things. Like, today's bikes are just incredible. It is genuinely really tough to not get a bike you can enjoy a lot.
Yeah.
So it's not often you find an opportunity to stress the positive, but let's take a second to acknowledge that it's just really good. There's stuff out there right now is really good, and you can have a lot of fun on the mountain bike I think probably there are plenty of nits to pick and plenty of little things. I think there is a bit of a lack of unity with some of the stuff that's probably like the deeper answer around standards.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lack of just a lack of unity and willingness to work together.
Cooperation.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not necessarily a pointing fingers and blame and stuff like that. It's largely, there is a positive side of it, is the bicycles are so innovative that you do have people constantly trying to push the envelope and trying to do things that are different. It's just that at scale, that stuff gets to be a drag. It's a drag for us, for the riders, for the consumers. You buy something and then, oh geez, now my this won't fit that, and that's a pain. And it's that's always been with us to some degree, but some type of a little more coherency around that would make all our lives a little better. And with the contact points and like the key points where you have to switch out parts and stuff like that. You don't want to stifle innovation, but a little consistency there would certainly help out the person who's paying cash money for these products.
Yeah. Well, that's the price that I guess we all pay for this innovation. And yeah, I mean, largely it's a really positive note to end on, to say, bikes are awesome right now, and there's a lot worse things we could be talking about and experiencing. So yeah, thank you for taking the time and for walking us through sort of how you did this, how you came up with 3VO and what you've done in the industry. So thanks.
No problem. Great talking to you. Thanks very much.
Well, that's all we've got this week. We'll talk to you again next week.